October 15th, 1815. The Pembroke ballroom glittered with candlelight and autumn splendor, crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across walls adorned with garlands of bronze chrysanthemums and deep crimson dahlias. Yet Eleanor Langdon stood as still as a portrait in grey silk, positioned near the open terrace doors where the cool night air carried the melancholy scent of dying roses from the garden below. At 28, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her modest dress, with its careful lace trim, chosen specifically not to draw attention, her posture correct but unremarkable, her expression pleasantly neutral in the way that allowed others to look through her rather than at her. The music swelled, a country dance reaching its crescendo. And across the polished floor, her younger sister Catherine swept past in the arms of a handsome lieutenant, golden curls bouncing, face flushed with the pleasure of being seen, being desired, being young enough that society had not yet written her off as unsalvageable. Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest, that peculiar combination of resigned melancholy and fiercely suppressed hope that had become her constant companion at these events. She had attended 47 balls since her first season a decade ago. She had counted them in her journal with the precision of a scholar documenting specimens, each one a small death of possibility. Near the refreshment table, Miss Lydia Ashworth held court among a circle of admirers, her laugh carrying across the room with the sharp brightness of breaking glass. And Eleanor caught the moment when Lydia's gaze flickered toward her, registered her presence with the barest hint of contempt, then dismissed her entirely as one might dismiss a piece of furniture. This too was familiar. The whispers had followed Eleanor through 7 seasons. Too old, too plain, too serious, too much the blue-stocking with her love of literature and philosophy when she should have been perfecting the art of flirtation. Her mother had stopped introducing her with optimism 3 years ago, and now Mrs. Harriet Langdon merely brought her to events out of obligation, sighing over what might have been if Eleanor had only been prettier or younger or willing to simper and pretend fascination with tedious conversations about weather and fashion. Eleanor had built her defenses carefully, brick by brick, telling herself that dignity and loneliness was its own achievement, that she preferred books to empty-headed suitors, that invisibility was a choice rather than a sentence. But standing there by the terrace doors as the ballroom swirled with color and movement and the possibility of love that belonged to everyone except her, she felt the weight of every year, every disappointed hope, every time she had dressed carefully, only to spend the evening watching others dance. Then she felt it. The pressure of a gaze, sustained and deliberate. She looked up, years of trained invisibility making the gesture instinctive, and found herself meeting the eyes of Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornfield, across the crowded ballroom. He was not looking through her. He was looking at her, and everything changed. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, a small, involuntary sound she hoped the music covered, and she felt her hands begin to tremble where they rested against the grey silk of her skirts. The fabric suddenly too thin, a barrier between herself and the impossible reality unfolding before her as Alexander Ravenscroft moved through the crowded ballroom with unmistakable purpose, his tall frame cutting through the kaleidoscope of dancers and chattering guests like a ship parting water, his dark evening clothes immaculate, his expression composed but intent in a way that made her heart hammer against her ribs with a force that felt almost painful. She had seen the Duke before, of course, at a handful of events over the past 2 years since he had emerged from mourning, always remote and formal, always departing early, his handsome face set in lines of polite disinterest that discouraged approach. and she had never imagined, not even in her most secret and foolish fantasies, that he might look at her the way he had looked at her just moments ago, as though she were someone worth seeing, someone worth crossing a ballroom to approach. The rational part of her mind, the part that had learned caution through a decade of disappointment, whispered warnings that she was misinterpreting, that he must be walking toward someone else, that in another moment he would pass by her position near the terrace doors without acknowledgement, and she would feel the familiar burn of humiliation for having hoped at all. But he did not pass by. He stopped directly before her, and she found herself looking up into eyes of remarkable grey, storm-coloured and intelligent, framed by dark lashes that any woman would envy. And when he spoke, his voice was deeper than she had expected, cultured and warm despite its formality. "Miss Langdon, if I am not mistaken." She managed a curtsy, years of training overriding her shock, and found her voice, though it emerged softer than she intended. "Your Grace, you have the advantage of me. I confess I have been observing you this past quarter hour," he said, and there was something in his directness that felt almost startling in its honesty, as though he had decided to dispense with the usual social pretenses. "I hope you will forgive the presumption, but I find myself curious about a woman who chooses to stand apart from the crush, who watches a ballroom as though she were studying a fascinating but slightly ridiculous play." Around them, Eleanor felt rather than saw the shift in attention, the way conversations stuttered and heads turned, the ripple of awareness spreading through the assembly that the Duke of Thornfield, who had spoken to virtually no one beyond his closest friends since returning to society, was engaged in conversation with Eleanor Langdon, the invisible spinster in grey. Her cheeks warmed with a flush she could not control, part embarrassment and part something more dangerous, something that felt treacherously like hope. "I did not think anyone was watching me," she said, and immediately regretted the words for their gracelessness, for the way they revealed too much of her years of being overlooked. "Perhaps," he replied, and something that might have been a smile softened the corners of his mouth. "That is because most people do not know how to see what is worth watching. Tell me, Miss Langdon, do you dance, or do you prefer your role as observer?" The waltz was beginning, the opening strains of music floating through the air, sweet and haunting, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as she understood what he was asking, what he was offering, the impossibility of it warring with the fierce, sudden longing that rose in her chest. "I dance, Your Grace," she heard herself say, though I confess it has been some time since anyone has asked. Then his hand settled at her waist, warm and steady through the grey silk, his other hand taking hers with a gentle firmness that made her acutely aware of every point of contact between them, and the ballroom seemed to tilt and spin even before they began to move, the waltz carrying them into its sweeping rhythm as Eleanor struggled to remember how to breathe, how to maintain the proper distance, how to do anything except feel the impossible reality of Alexander Ravenscroft's attention focused entirely upon her, as though she were the only woman in a room full of beauty and youth and everything she had been told she lacked. She could feel the weight of every eye upon them, the shocked silence that had fallen over the nearest conversation, the way even the dancers around them seemed to falter for half a beat as they registered the extraordinary sight of the Duke dancing with Eleanor Langdon, and part of her wanted to pull away, to flee back to her safe invisibility before the inevitable humiliation came. But his hand at her waist anchored her, steady and sure, and when she dared to meet his eyes again, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart stutter in her chest. "You are an excellent dancer, Miss Langdon," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it beneath the soaring music, "though I suspect you have had little opportunity to demonstrate the skill." Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks, that treacherous blush that always betrayed her emotions no matter how carefully she tried to maintain composure. And she forced herself to meet his gaze with what dignity she could muster. "You are kind to say so, Your Grace, though I fear you will find me sadly out of practice." "On the contrary," he replied, and there was something almost fierce in his expression now, something that made her breath catch. "I find you utterly captivating, and I confess I am not a man given to empty flattery. Tell me, what were you thinking about when I first saw you standing by the terrace doors, looking as though you were 1,000 miles away from this ballroom?" The question was so unexpected, so intimate in its curiosity, that Eleanor nearly stumbled, saved only by the strength of his lead as he guided her smoothly through the turn, and she found herself answering with an honesty she had not intended, the words slipping past her careful defenses. "I was thinking that I have become very skilled at being invisible, Your Grace, and wondering if perhaps that was easier than continuing to hope for anything different." She saw something flash in his grey eyes, something that might have been anger or pain or recognition, and his hand tightened fractionally at her waist, drawing her perhaps an inch closer than strict propriety allowed, close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of his cologne, something clean and masculine that made her dizzy. "Then allow me to assure you, Miss Langdon," he said, and his voice had gone even lower, rough with an emotion she could not quite name, "that you are not invisible to me, and I very much hope you will allow me the opportunity to prove that I see you far more clearly than you realize." The waltz ended far too soon, the final notes of music fading into the ambient hum of the ballroom as Alexander guided her through the last turn, and Eleanor felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache as he stepped back the requisite proper distance, though something in his eyes suggested he felt the separation as keenly as she did. And when he offered his arm to escort her from the floor, she took it with fingers that trembled slightly against the fine wool of his evening coat, acutely aware that every eye in the ballroom remained fixed upon them with an intensity that made her skin prickle with anxious awareness. She could hear the whispers starting already, a susurrus of speculation and shock rippling through the assembled guests like wind through autumn leaves, and she caught fragments of conversation as they passed. The words carefully not quite loud enough to be direct address, but certainly intended to be overheard, observations about her age and her unremarkable appearance, and the absolutely extraordinary nature of the Duke's attention, questions about what could possibly have induced a man of his standing to dance with Eleanor Langdon of all people, and she felt her brief moment of joy beginning to curdle into familiar shame, the old certainty that she was somehow less than others reasserting itself with painful force. But then Alexander's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a brief pressure that felt like reassurance and solidarity, and when she dared to glance up at him, she found his expression had gone cool and remote, that ducal reserve settling over his features like armor as he surveyed the ballroom with a gaze that seemed to dare anyone to comment within his hearing. "Miss Langdon," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that those nearest could hear, his tone formal but warm, "I wonder if you might do me the honor of introducing me to your mother, as I find I have a request to make of her regarding future acquaintance." Eleanor's heart lurched in her chest, a wild, desperate leap that felt almost painful, because surely he could not mean what those words suggested. Surely she was misunderstanding the implication that he wished to call upon her formally, that this was not merely a single extraordinary dance, but the beginning of something more. She managed to nod, not trusting her voice, and guided him across the ballroom toward where her mother sat with the other matrons, watching the exchange between her daughter and the Duke with an expression of such transparent shock and hope that Eleanor felt a surge of sympathy for her. For all the years Mrs. Harriet Langdon had watched her elder daughter overlooked and dismissed while trying to maintain optimism in the face of social reality. As they approached, Eleanor saw her mother rise with a flutter of nervous energy, her hands smoothing over her gown in an anxious gesture Eleanor knew well, and nearby she was aware of Catherine breaking away from her dancing partner mid-conversation to hurry toward them, her younger sister's pretty face alight with curiosity, and something that might have been concern or perhaps vicarious excitement. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, her voice steadier than she felt, "may I present my mother, Mrs. Harriet Langdon, and my sister, Lady Catherine Pembroke. Mamma Catherine, His Grace the Duke of Thornfield." She watched her mother sink into a curtsy, far deeper than strictly necessary, flustered pleasure pinkening her cheeks, while Catherine executed a more practiced greeting, her sharp blue eyes moving between Eleanor and Alexander with obvious speculation. Eleanor had not slept the night of the ball, lying awake in her narrow bed in the modest townhouse on Brook Street. As the hours crept toward dawn, replaying every moment of the evening with an intensity that felt almost painful, the memory of Alexander's hand at her waist, and his grey eyes fixed upon her face with such focused attention seeming simultaneously absolutely real and utterly impossible, a dream she feared would dissolve into nothingness with the arrival of morning light. And now, as she sat in the small morning room, with weak October sunlight filtering through windows that looked out onto the street, wearing a morning dress of pale blue muslin that suddenly seemed hopelessly plain and unfashionable, she felt the full weight of her anxiety settling over her like a heavy cloak, the certainty that he would not come, that whatever madness had possessed him last night to single her out would have faded with sleep and sobriety, leaving him to wake with embarrassment at his inexplicable attention to Eleanor Langdon, 28 years old and thoroughly unremarkable in every way that society valued. Her mother had been fluttering about the house since early morning, unable to settle to any task, alternating between anxious speculation about whether the Duke would truly call and dire warnings that Eleanor must not allow herself to hope too much, must not set herself up for the inevitable disappointment that surely awaited, though Mrs. Harriet Langdon's own face was alight with a hope she could not quite suppress, decades of watching her elder daughter overlooked and dismissed, having not entirely extinguished the maternal dream of seeing Eleanor happily settled. Catherine had arrived shortly after breakfast, having left her own household on Grosvenor Square with unusual haste, still in her morning clothes and barely pausing to greet their mother before pulling Eleanor into the small sitting room with an expression caught somewhere between excitement and concern. Her pretty face flushed as she demanded to know every detail of what had transpired after Eleanor and the Duke had left the ballroom floor, whether he had said anything to indicate his intentions, whether Eleanor had any idea what could have prompted such extraordinary attention from a man who had shown no interest in society since emerging from mourning. "I do not know, Catherine," Eleanor had said quietly, twisting her hands together in her lap in a gesture she knew betrayed her agitation. He asked permission to call, but perhaps in the clear light of day he will think better of it. Perhaps last night was simply a moment of kindness toward a wallflower, and I am foolish to imagine it meant anything more. But Catherine had shaken her head with the certainty of someone accustomed to male attention, insisting that dukes did not dance with women out of mere kindness, did not request permission to call unless they had serious intentions, though even as she spoke Eleanor could see the worry in her sister's eyes, the unspoken concern that society would be cruel about any connection between the distinguished Duke of Thornfield and unremarkable Eleanor Langdon. And now, as the clock on the mantel ticked toward noon, the proper hour for morning calls, Eleanor found herself caught between desperate hope and the safer refuge of expecting nothing, her eyes drawn again and again to the window that overlooked the street, watching for a carriage that she told herself would not come. The clock struck noon with a clear chime that seemed to reverberate through Eleanor's entire body as she sat in the drawing-room, attempting to maintain some semblance of composure, her hands folded tightly in her lap to still their trembling, while her mother made yet another circuit of the room, adjusting a cushion here and straightening a vase of bronze chrysanthemums there, both of them pretending not to be listening for the sound of a carriage on the street below, and when it finally came, the rattle of wheels on cobblestones and the subsequent knock at the front door. Eleanor felt her heart leap so violently she thought she might be ill, her breath catching in her throat as she heard their elderly butler Henderson's slow progress down the hall and the low murmur of masculine voices in the entry. And then Henderson appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely suppressed excitement that would have been amusing under other circumstances, announcing in his most formal tones that His Grace the Duke of Thornfield was calling and presenting a card on a small silver tray. And Eleanor rose on legs that felt unsteady as Alexander entered the room, impossibly elegant in dark mourning clothes that made his grey eyes seem even more striking, carrying himself with that natural authority that came from generations of aristocratic breeding, but with a warmth in his expression as his gaze found hers that made something in her chest tighten almost painfully. He bowed first to her mother with perfect courtesy, then turned to Eleanor with a deeper inclination that felt almost intimate despite its propriety. And she managed a curtsy that she hoped did not betray the weakness in her knees, hyper-aware of how modest their drawing-room must appear to a man accustomed to ducal residences. The furniture respectable but somewhat worn, the carpet faded in places from years of use, the whole space speaking of genteel limitations rather than wealth. But if Alexander noticed or cared about such things, his manner gave no indication. Accepting Mrs. Langdon's flustered invitation to sit with gracious ease and settling into the chair opposite Eleanor with the kind of relaxed attention that suggested he was exactly where he wished to be. Her mother, to her credit, managed to rally her composure enough to offer tea, which Alexander accepted, and then with a delicacy Eleanor had not entirely expected. Mrs. Langdon positioned herself near the window with some needlework, close enough to serve as proper chaperone, but far enough to allow private conversation, and Eleanor found herself meeting Alexander's gaze across the small space between them, seeing something warm and intent there that made her earlier fears seem almost foolish. "Miss Langdon," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that felt like a caress. "I hope you will forgive the presumption, but I took the liberty of bringing you something I thought you might enjoy." And he withdrew from his coat a slim volume bound in green leather, and when she took it from him their fingers brushed in a contact that sent awareness singing along her nerves, and she saw the title stamped in gold, Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads, the very collection they had discussed so briefly at the ball, and she looked up at him with something like wonder, realizing that he had not only remembered their conversation, but had acted upon it, had thought of her in the hours since they parted, and had taken care to bring her something meaningful. The 4 days since Alexander's first call had passed in a blur of morning visits and afternoon walks that felt to Eleanor like living inside a dream from which she might wake at any moment. And now, as his elegant barouche carried them along the tree-lined paths of Hyde Park at the fashionable hour of 3 o'clock on a crisp October afternoon when the autumn foliage blazed gold and crimson against a sky of crystalline blue, she felt acutely aware of the eyes that followed their progress, the whispers that rippled through the crowds of fashionable society, taking their daily promenade along Rotten Row, and she sat very straight on the carriage seat in the new walking dress of forest green wool that her mother had insisted on ordering from the modiste with an extravagance that spoke of hope and determination. The Spencer jacket fitted perfectly to her figure in a way that her usual modest gowns never had been, and when Alexander had arrived to collect her for this drive, his eyes had warmed with unmistakable appreciation as he told her the color brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes that he had noticed during their waltz. A compliment so specific and personal it had made her flush with pleasure, even as part of her mind whispered that she should not allow herself to become accustomed to such attention. Alexander himself seemed utterly at ease as he handled the reins with casual expertise, pointing out various landmarks and relating amusing anecdotes about the park's history in a way that helped settle her nerves, and she found herself actually laughing at one of his stories, the sound feeling rusty and unfamiliar, when she caught sight of Lydia Ashworth walking with her mother, Mrs. Ashworth, and another young lady, all three elaborately dressed in the height of fashion, and Lydia's beautiful face registered shock, and then something harder, as she took in the sight of Eleanor Langdon sitting beside the Duke of Thornfield, looking almost pretty in her new green dress. Eleanor felt her laughter die in her throat, and her hands tightened on the reticule in her lap. Old habits of shrinking and trying to become invisible rising despite her best efforts. But Alexander seemed to sense the change in her, and without breaking the flow of his conversation, he reached over and covered her gloved hand briefly with his own, the gesture both comforting and possessive. And as they passed Lydia's group, he inclined his head with perfect courtesy, but did not stop, keeping his attention primarily on Eleanor in a way that made a very public statement about where his interest lay. They had progressed perhaps another 20 yards when they encountered Lord George Beaumont riding a handsome bay gelding, and Alexander's friend pulled up alongside their carriage with a broad grin that transformed his ruddy features, greeting them both with genuine warmth and telling Eleanor with transparent sincerity that it was delightful to see his oldest friend looking so well and happy, a comment that made Alexander smile in a way Eleanor had not seen before, open and almost boyish, and she realized with a start that he had been lonely too, perhaps in different ways than her own loneliness, but real nonetheless. As they continued their circuit of the park, Eleanor glimpsed Sophia walking with her husband, Mr. Fairfax, and her friend's face lit with such obvious joy and approval that Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, the validation from someone who truly knew and cared for her meaning more than she could easily express. And Alexander must have noticed her emotion, because he said quietly, for her ears alone, that she deserved to have friends who celebrated her happiness, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life ensuring she never doubted her own worth again. The evening of October 25th arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt like a gift after days of grey autumn chill, and Eleanor sat before her mirror in her modest bedchamber, watching her mother's maid arrange her hair in a softer style than she usually wore, preparing for dinner at Sophia's townhouse with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that felt different from the anxiety that had plagued her at larger social events, because this was to be an intimate gathering of only 6 people, including herself and Alexander, Sophia and her kind husband, Mr. Fairfax, and another married couple of Sophia's acquaintance, the kind of evening where real conversation might happen rather than the performative social rituals of balls and formal calls. She had chosen to wear a gown of rose-colored silk that her mother had insisted on commissioning from the modiste, along with the green walking dress, and when Eleanor had protested the extravagance and the color, claiming that at 28 she was far too old for such youthful shades, her mother had looked at her with unexpected fierceness, and said that Eleanor had spent too many years trying to disappear into grey and beige, and it was time she allowed herself to be seen. And now, looking at her reflection, Eleanor had to admit that the warm rose brought color to her cheeks, and made her hazel eyes seem larger and brighter. And when Alexander arrived to collect her in his carriage, his sharp intake of breath, and the way his grey eyes darkened as he looked at her, made her feel almost beautiful for the first time in her adult life. The drive to Sophia's elegant townhouse in Mayfair passed in comfortable conversation about the book of Coleridge's poetry he had given her, which she had now read through twice and found full of images and ideas she wanted to discuss with him, and she noticed how he listened to her observations with complete attention, asking questions that showed he valued her mind and her opinions, never once making her feel that her thoughts were silly or inconsequential, as so many men did when women ventured to speak of literature or philosophy. Sophia greeted them at the door of her candle-lit drawing-room with such obvious delight that Eleanor felt some of her nervous tension ease, and Mr. Fairfax proved to be as warm and welcoming as his wife, a scholarly gentleman who worked in the Foreign Office and treated Eleanor with the same respect he showed the other guests. And as they moved into the intimate dining room with its table set for 6 and walls painted a soft gold that glowed in the candlelight, Eleanor found herself actually relaxing into the evening, laughing at amusing stories and contributing her own observations, feeling for the first time in recent memory that she belonged in such company, that she was not merely tolerated, but genuinely welcomed. The dinner itself was excellent, but not ostentatious, the kind of meal that spoke of good taste rather than display. And the conversation ranged freely across topics from the political situation in Europe following Napoleon's final defeat to the latest novels to the scandalous behavior of the Prince Regent, and Eleanor noticed how Alexander seemed more at ease here than she had seen him even during their private calls, his natural wit and intelligence on full display without the guardedness he wore in larger social settings. And she understood suddenly that he too had been lonely in his grief, surrounded by people but truly known by very few. After dinner they retired to Sophia's music room, where a pianoforte stood near the windows and comfortable chairs were arranged for conversation. And it was there, as Eleanor sat beside Alexander on a small sofa upholstered in blue damask, while Sophia played a gentle Mozart sonata, that he began to speak quietly of his late wife, not with the shuttered pain she had glimpsed before, but with a kind of peaceful remembrance, telling her that Caroline had been his childhood friend before becoming his duchess, that they had loved each other with deep affection, though perhaps not the passionate intensity that novels portrayed, and that her death from a fever 2 years ago had left him adrift until he had slowly realized that she would not have wanted him to stop living. And Eleanor listened with her whole heart, understanding the trust he was placing in her by sharing this grief. And she said softly that Caroline must have been a remarkable woman to have earned such faithful love, and that Eleanor hoped she would have approved of her, and Alexander turned to look at her with such intensity that her breath caught. And he said in a voice meant only for her ears that he believed Caroline would have loved Eleanor's kindness and intelligence and generous spirit, and that he knew with absolute certainty that what he felt for Eleanor was different from but no less real than what he had felt for his first wife. And in that moment, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a flowering of hope, that perhaps this was not a dream that would dissolve, but something solid and true that might actually last. The note arrived at the Langdon residence at 9:30 on the morning of October 28th, delivered by Alexander's footman in the Duke's distinctive livery. And Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and read the brief message in his bold handwriting, requesting that she call at his London residence at 11 o'clock that morning if it was convenient, as he had a matter of some importance he wished to discuss with her in private, and her mother, who was watching her face with anxious attention, immediately began speculating about what this unprecedented summons might mean. For while Alexander had called on them numerous times at their home, it was highly unusual for an unmarried lady to visit a gentleman's residence, even with proper chaperoning, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness, as she tried to calm her mother's excitement, while acknowledging to herself that something significant must be prompting this breach of usual social patterns. She dressed with particular care in her day dress of pale blue muslin that Alexander had once said reminded him of a summer sky, and her mother insisted that her hair be arranged in the softer style that had become Eleanor's custom since the night of the Pembroke ball, and when the clock struck 10:30, her mother herself accompanied Eleanor in their modest carriage for the short journey to Alexander's impressive townhouse in Grosvenor Square, promising to wait in the carriage while Eleanor went inside for what her mother kept calling with meaningful emphasis this very important conversation. The day itself seemed to reflect Eleanor's inner turbulence, rain falling steadily from grey clouds that matched the uncertain mixture of hope and fear churning in her chest. And when Alexander's butler showed her into the Duke's private study rather than the formal drawing-room, she understood that whatever was about to happen was meant to be truly private and personal. The study was a masculine room lined with books and dominated by a large mahogany desk. But a fire burned warmly in the grate, and 2 comfortable chairs were positioned near it, and Alexander rose from one of these as she entered, and Eleanor's breath caught at the expression on his face, a mixture of determination and nervousness that she had never seen there before. And he came to her immediately, taking both her hands in his without the usual formality of polite greeting, and she could feel that his hands were not quite steady. He led her to the chairs by the fire, but did not sit, instead keeping hold of her hands as he looked down at her with those grey eyes that had come to mean everything to her. And he said that he had been planning an elegant speech full of poetry and fine phrases, but found now that all such artifice had deserted him, and he could only speak the plain truth of his heart, which was that in the 2 weeks since the Pembroke ball he had come to understand that what he felt for her was not merely affection or regard, but genuine and deep love, the kind that made him want to spend every day for the rest of his life ensuring her happiness, and that if she could find it in her heart to accept him, despite all the pain his first marriage and loss had taught him about the fragility of life, he would count himself the most fortunate man in England, and would she do him the very great honour of becoming his wife. Eleanor could scarcely breathe as the meaning of Alexander's words settled over her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and she found herself looking up into his grey eyes that were watching her face with such intensity and hope and fear that she understood he truly did not know what her answer would be. And the realization that this powerful man, this Duke who could have his choice of any woman in England, was standing before her nervous and uncertain, waiting for her acceptance, made something break open in her chest. All the years of feeling invisible and unwanted and resigned to spinsterhood suddenly revealed as a long darkness before this blazing moment of being truly seen and genuinely loved. Her voice when she found it was barely more than a whisper as she said yes, that she would be honored beyond measure to become his wife, that she had not dared to hope for such happiness. But now that he offered it, she would accept it with her whole heart, and she saw his expression transform from anxious hope to pure joy as he raised her hands to his lips and kissed them with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. And then he was reaching into his waistcoat pocket and producing a small velvet box, which he opened to reveal a ring of breathtaking beauty, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds set in gold. And he told her it had been his grandmother's ring, that his grandfather had chosen the sapphire because it matched her eyes, and his grandmother had been the great love of his grandfather's long life, and he had always known he would give this ring only to a woman he loved with that same depth and certainty. Eleanor's hands were trembling as he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, the sapphire gleaming in the firelight like a piece of captured sky, and she could not stop looking at it, even as Alexander drew her to her feet and into his arms, holding her with a careful tenderness that made her feel precious and protected. And she let herself rest against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart, and thinking that 3 weeks ago she had been invisible at a ball, resigned to permanent loneliness, and now she was engaged to be married to a man who loved her, not despite her lack of conventional beauty or youth or social brilliance, but because of who she actually was, the person no one else had bothered to see. They stood together by the fire for several minutes, neither wanting to break the spell of this perfect moment, and then Alexander said gently that her mother was waiting outside in the carriage and they should go share their news, and Eleanor laughed a little at the thought of her mother's reaction, knowing that Mrs. Langdon had been hoping for exactly this outcome, but would still be shocked and delighted beyond measure that it had actually happened. And as they prepared to leave his study, Alexander stopped and turned to her, once more saying that he wanted her to know he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never regretted accepting him, that he would honor and cherish her, and defend her against anyone who failed to see her worth. And Eleanor reached up to touch his face gently and told him that she already knew all of that because she had seen his character and his heart. And that was why she loved him. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post on the morning of October 30th, precisely where such things were meant to appear in the marriages column, the brief formal lines stating that the Duke of Thornfield had the honor of announcing his engagement to Miss Eleanor Langdon, eldest daughter of the late Mr. Thomas Langdon of Hampshire. And Eleanor sat at the breakfast table in the morning room of the Langdon residence, staring at those printed words that made everything irrevocably real and public, her mother having already read the announcement aloud 3 times with increasing emotion, and the sapphire ring on Eleanor's finger seemed to catch every ray of the weak autumn sunlight, as if determined to draw attention to itself and to her newly transformed status. She had barely slept the night before, knowing that today would mark the moment when their private joy became subject to public scrutiny and judgment. And though Alexander had assured her the previous evening, when he called, that his position and the certainty of his choice would shield them from the worst of society's criticism, Eleanor knew enough of the world to understand that there would be those who would question why a duke would choose a 28-year-old spinster of modest fortune and no remarkable beauty when he might have had his pick of younger, prettier, more accomplished women. The first callers arrived shortly after 10 o'clock, and Eleanor was grateful that the initial visitors were Sophia and her husband, Mr. Fairfax, who came with genuine joy and warm congratulations. Sophia embracing Eleanor tightly and whispering that she had never been so happy for anyone in her entire life, and Mr. Fairfax shaking Mrs. Langdon's hand and saying that the Duke had shown himself to be a man of excellent judgment and discernment. But the morning's stream of callers brought a mixed response that revealed the divided nature of society's reaction. Some coming with what appeared to be sincere good wishes, while others arrived with barely concealed curiosity, and the kind of pointed questions that felt more like interrogation than courtesy, and Eleanor found herself subjected to intense scrutiny, as various ladies examined her appearance and manner, as if trying to solve the puzzle of what the Duke could possibly see in someone so unremarkable. Lady Ashworth arrived with Lydia at 11:30, and though the older woman's congratulations were formally correct, there was a coldness in her eyes that matched the frost in her daughter's smile, and Lydia's voice had an edge like cut glass as she said how surprising everyone found the news, and how they all wondered at the Duke's choice given his late wife's remarkable beauty and accomplishments. The implication that Eleanor could not possibly measure up to such a standard hanging in the air like smoke. Mrs. Langdon's face flushed with anger at this barely veiled insult, but before she could respond, they heard Alexander's voice in the hall asking to be shown in, and Eleanor felt her heart lift as it always did at the sound of him. And when he entered the morning room, his grey eyes went immediately to her face, reading her distress with the perceptiveness that was one of the qualities she most loved in him. Eleanor had accompanied Catherine to Madame Bouchard's establishment on Bond Street that cold grey afternoon of November 2nd, seeking to order new gloves and perhaps a shawl. Telling herself that she must continue with ordinary activities despite the whispers and stares that seemed to follow her everywhere since the engagement announcement, and the shop was warm and crowded with several other ladies examining fabrics and trimmings, and Eleanor was standing near a display of silk ribbons when she heard Lydia Ashworth's voice carrying clearly from the other side of a tall shelf, saying that everyone was still utterly baffled by the Duke's incomprehensible choice, that poor dear Alexander must still be quite mad with grief over losing his beautiful wife to have settled on such a plain, drab creature as Eleanor Langdon. And another voice that Eleanor recognized as belonging to Miss Caroline Harcourt responded with a laugh that perhaps the Duke's eyesight was failing. Or perhaps he had chosen someone so unremarkable because he wanted a wife who would never challenge him or expect actual affection, just gratitude for being rescued from spinsterhood. Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, each one finding the tender places where her own doubts lived. And though she had endured years of being overlooked and dismissed, this particular cruelty cut deeper because it touched not just her own worth but Alexander's judgment and happiness. And she stood frozen behind the ribbon display, feeling the blood drain from her face, while Catherine gripped her arm with white-knuckled fingers. Her sister's face flushed with anger, but her voice dropping to an urgent whisper as she suggested they leave immediately through the side entrance. But before Eleanor could move, she heard the shop bell chime, and then Alexander's voice asking the proprietress if Miss Langdon was present, and Eleanor's heart began racing with a sick mixture of relief at his presence and horror that he might overhear the cruel gossip. And she stepped around the shelf on trembling legs to see him standing near the entrance in his dark greatcoat, with drops of rain glistening on his shoulders. And his grey eyes found her face immediately, and she watched his expression shift from warmth to sharp concern as he read her distress with that uncanny perceptiveness she had come to depend upon. He crossed the shop to her side in 4 long strides, ignoring the sudden hush that fell over the other customers, and he took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture of such deliberate public tenderness that Eleanor heard someone gasp. And then he turned to face Lydia and Miss Harcourt, who had emerged from behind the shelf, both wearing expressions of frozen shock, and his voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried to every corner of the now silent shop, as he said that he had been hoping to encounter some of society's self-appointed arbiters of worth, because he wished to make something perfectly clear. He said that his choice of bride was the most intelligent decision he had made in his entire life, that Miss Langdon possessed more genuine beauty in her smallest gesture than most women achieved in a lifetime of studied artifice, that her mind was finer and her heart more generous than anyone he had ever known, including his late wife whom he had loved, but who would have been the first to acknowledge Eleanor's superior qualities, and that anyone who questioned his judgment or spoke disparagingly of his future duchess would find themselves permanently excluded from his acquaintance and the acquaintance of anyone who valued his goodwill. The engagement ball at Thornfield House on the evening of November the 5th was the first major social event at which Eleanor and Alexander would appear together as an officially engaged couple, and Eleanor stood in her bedroom at the Langdon residence at 7 o'clock that evening, while her mother and Catherine helped her dress in a gown of deep sapphire silk that matched her engagement ring, the color so rich and vibrant that it seemed to transform her appearance in ways her usual pale, modest shades never had, and she barely recognized the woman looking back at her from the mirror with flushed cheeks and bright eyes and an expression that held something new, something that looked almost like confidence. The past 3 days since the incident at the Modiste had wrought a subtle but profound change in Eleanor's understanding of herself and her place in the world. For Alexander's passionate public defense of her worth had forced her to confront the possibility that perhaps she had been wrong about her own value all these years, that perhaps the limitations she had accepted as truth were nothing more than society's arbitrary judgments. And though the old doubts still whispered in the quieter moments, she found herself able to push back against them now with the memory of Alexander's grey eyes blazing with conviction as he declared her superior to everyone who had dismissed her. Catherine fastened a necklace of sapphires and diamonds around Eleanor's neck, the jewels a gift from Alexander that had arrived that morning, with a note saying he wanted her adorned as befitted a duchess, and Mrs. Langdon stood back, with tears streaming down her face, saying that her daughter looked more beautiful than she had ever seen her. And Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest as she realized that tonight she would walk into a ballroom not as an invisible spinster haunting the margins, but as the chosen bride of a duke. And though she knew there would be those who sneered and whispered, she also knew that Alexander would be at her side, and that his regard was worth more than the approval of every spiteful voice in London. Alexander arrived at precisely 7:30 to escort them to Thornfield House, and when Eleanor descended the stairs and saw his expression transform from polite greeting to something like wonder, she felt her remaining doubts begin to dissolve like morning mist, and he took her hand and raised it to his lips and told her she was the most magnificent woman he had ever seen. And she believed him, because she had learned that Alexander Ravenscroft said exactly what he meant, and meant exactly what he said. And when he handed her into his carriage with such tender care, she felt herself becoming the woman he saw when he looked at her. A woman worthy of love and devotion and all the joy that had seemed impossible just 3 short weeks ago, when she had stood invisible by the terrace doors at the Pembroke ball. Thornfield House blazed with what seemed like 1,000 candles as Alexander's carriage drew up to the entrance at 8:15 on that cold November evening, and Eleanor could see through the windows that the ballroom was already crowded with London's most prominent families, all come to witness the engagement ball that had become the most discussed event of the season. And she felt her heart begin to race as Alexander handed her down from the carriage with such tender care that she drew strength from the warmth of his gloved hand holding hers. They entered through the main doors, and Eleanor was immediately struck by the magnificent transformation of the house. For though she had visited briefly for tea, she had never seen the grand public rooms dressed for a ball, and the entrance hall was filled with towering arrangements of white roses and deep blue delphiniums that echoed the colors of her gown and ring, and Alexander leaned close to whisper that he had instructed the florist to match her eyes, which he said were more beautiful than any sapphire. The receiving line formed quickly as guests began to arrive in greater numbers, and Eleanor found herself standing beside Alexander at the ballroom entrance, greeting Duke and Earl and Viscountess and Baron, watching faces that ranged from genuinely warm to barely concealed skepticism. And she kept her chin high and her voice steady as she acknowledged each greeting with the dignity that Alexander had told her was her birthright, regardless of what small minds might think. Lord Beaumont came through early with his cheerful face wreathed in smiles, clasping Alexander's hand and bowing over Eleanor's with such enthusiastic approval that she felt tears prick her eyes. And Sophia arrived shortly after in golden silk with her husband, and she embraced Eleanor with fierce affection, whispering that she looked like a queen and should remember that she had every right to be here. Then Lydia Ashworth appeared in the line, wearing pale pink and an expression of forced pleasantness, and Eleanor felt herself tense as the other woman offered congratulations in a voice like honey over poison, but Alexander's hand found the small of Eleanor's back in a gesture of support and protection that did not go unnoticed by Lydia, whose smile became even more brittle as she moved on. When the receiving was finished and the orchestra began to play, Alexander led Eleanor onto the floor for the opening waltz, which was their right as the engaged couple being honored. And as they took their positions, Eleanor looked up into his grey eyes and saw such love and pride there that something settled in her chest, some last fluttering doubt finally going still. And when the music began and he swept her into the dance, she felt as though she were floating, as though the girl who had stood invisible by terrace doors barely 3 weeks ago had been transformed into someone new. Someone who belonged in this glittering ballroom, not because a duke had chosen her, but because she had finally chosen to believe in her own worth. The waltz ended to enthusiastic applause that seemed to echo through the magnificent ballroom at Thornfield House, and as Alexander led Eleanor from the floor, she noticed how the crowd parted for them with a deference that felt entirely new, as though his public claiming of her had transformed her from invisible spinster to woman of consequence, and she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes following their progress toward the refreshment room, where champagne waited in crystal flutes on silver trays. They were immediately surrounded by well-wishers who offered congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity, and Eleanor found herself responding with a grace she had not known she possessed. Her voice steady and warm as she thanked Lady Pemberton and smiled at the effusive compliments of Mrs. Whitmore. And through it all, Alexander remained at her side, with his hand resting possessively at the small of her back in a gesture that communicated his devotion more clearly than any words could have done. Lord Beaumont appeared with champagne for them both, and a toast that made the surrounding guests laugh, with its good-natured teasing of Alexander for having kept his courtship so private, and Eleanor caught Sophia's eye across the room and saw her friend beaming with such genuine happiness that she felt tears threaten and had to blink them back quickly. Then the crowd shifted, and she saw Lydia Ashworth standing near the windows, watching with an expression that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. For there was such naked jealousy and malice in those beautiful features that it seemed impossible anyone could miss it, and beside Lydia stood two other young women whose expressions mirrored their leaders, and Eleanor knew with sudden certainty that whatever poison had been spread about her engagement had originated from that particular corner of society. Alexander must have felt her tension because he leaned close and murmured a question about her comfort, and she turned to meet his concerned grey eyes, and felt her anxiety ease because whatever Lydia thought or said or did, it could not touch the truth of what existed between Eleanor and the man who had chosen her above all others. The evening continued with dance after dance, and Alexander stood up with her for 3 waltzes, which was just barely within the bounds of propriety for an engaged couple, but still raised eyebrows among the more conservative matrons, and Eleanor found she did not care, because the joy of being held in his arms and swept around the floor while the orchestra played and the candles blazed was worth any amount of whispered criticism. When supper was announced at 10:30, Alexander escorted her into the dining room, where places of honor had been set at the head of the long table, and as Eleanor took her seat with him beside her and looked down the length of white linen and gleaming silver at the assembled guests who had come to celebrate their engagement, she felt the last remnants of her old invisible self finally slip away. The supper at the engagement ball concluded near midnight, and the guests began to filter back into the ballroom where the orchestra had resumed playing, and Eleanor felt the pleasant exhaustion that came from hours of smiling and conversing and being the center of attention in a way she had never experienced in all her 28 years. And when Alexander suggested they take a brief respite in the conservatory, she agreed with relief, because though the evening had been wonderful, it had also been overwhelming in its intensity. They slipped away from the crowd through a side door that led to the glass-enclosed conservatory that ran along the south side of Thornfield House, and immediately the noise of the ball faded to a distant murmur, replaced by the quiet drip of the fountain and the rich green scent of growing things. And Eleanor breathed deeply as Alexander lit several of the lamps that hung among the orange trees and palms, creating pools of golden light in the darkness. He came to stand beside her near the fountain, and for a moment they simply stood in companionable silence, looking back through the glass walls at the ballroom, where hundreds of candles blazed and couples whirled across the floor, and Eleanor thought how strange it was to look at that glittering scene from the outside, when just weeks ago she had always been on the periphery, even when standing in the middle of such gatherings. Alexander turned to her then and took both her hands in his and said that he wanted to thank her for her grace and dignity throughout the evening, for he knew that standing in receiving lines and making conversation with people who had previously ignored her could not have been easy, and she felt tears prick her eyes at his understanding, because he was right that it had required every bit of courage she possessed to smile at women who had looked through her for years as though she were invisible. She told him that his presence beside her had made it possible, that knowing he had chosen her and was proud of that choice had given her strength she had not known she possessed, and he raised her hands to his lips and kissed first one and then the other with such tenderness that her breath caught. Then he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, which he opened to reveal a delicate bracelet of sapphires and diamonds that matched her engagement ring, and he said he had commissioned it as a betrothal gift and wanted her to have it tonight as a symbol of his devotion and gratitude that she had accepted him. Eleanor protested that the ring was already too much, and he should not be spending such sums on her, but he silenced her objection by fastening the bracelet around her wrist himself and saying that spending his wealth on the woman he loved gave him greater joy than anything else he might do with it, and that she must accustom herself to being cherished because he intended to spend the rest of their lives ensuring she never again felt invisible or overlooked or less than the remarkable woman she was. The conservatory had grown cold as the night deepened, and Alexander suggested they return to the ballroom before their absence was noted with disapproval. And Eleanor agreed, though she was reluctant to leave this peaceful green sanctuary, where they had shared such tender moments away from the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes that seemed to weigh and judge her every expression and movement. They walked back through the glass doors into the warmth and noise of the ball, where the dancing continued with undiminished energy despite the late hour. And immediately Eleanor felt the weight of attention settle on her shoulders as faces turned toward them, and she knew that their absence had indeed been noted and would likely be discussed tomorrow over tea in a dozen drawing rooms across Mayfair. Alexander seemed entirely unconcerned by the speculative glances and led her directly onto the floor for another waltz. And as they moved through the familiar steps, Eleanor noticed that many of the guests were beginning to take their leave, the older matrons and their daughters departing, while the younger set remained determined to dance until dawn if the hosts would permit it. She caught sight of Lydia Ashworth near the refreshment table, speaking intently with a tall gentleman Eleanor did not recognize. And even from across the room, she could see the calculation in Lydia's expression and wondered what new mischief was being planned. For she had learned during the past weeks that Lydia's jealousy was not a passive thing, but an active force that sought to tear down what it could not possess. When the waltz ended, Alexander escorted her to where her mother sat with a group of older ladies who immediately made room for Eleanor and began offering compliments on the ball and the elegance of Thornfield House. And Mrs. Langdon looked so pleased and proud that Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude that her engagement had brought her mother such happiness after years of anxiety about her unmarried eldest daughter. Alexander excused himself to speak with Lord Beaumont and several other gentlemen, and Eleanor found herself subjected to a gentle interrogation about wedding plans and her future role as Duchess. Questions she answered as best she could, though many details remained undecided, and she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the changes that would soon transform her life entirely. Sophia appeared at her elbow with a cup of tea and a sympathetic smile, and murmured that Eleanor looked exhausted and should not hesitate to plead fatigue if she wished to leave, for no one would criticize a bride for being overwhelmed by her own engagement ball. Eleanor gratefully accepted the tea and admitted that she was indeed tired, not just from the physical demands of the evening, but from the emotional intensity of being constantly observed and discussed, and Sophia squeezed her hand and promised that it would become easier with time as society grew accustomed to the match and moved on to newer scandals. The engagement ball finally drew to a close near 2 o'clock in the morning, when even the most determined dancers had exhausted themselves, and the orchestra had played their final notes, and Eleanor stood beside Alexander in the grand foyer of Thornfield House, bidding farewell to the last departing guests, who offered final congratulations and thanks for a magnificent evening that would surely be discussed in drawing rooms across London for weeks to come. When the final carriage had rolled away down the torchlit drive, and the great doors were closed at last, Eleanor felt the energy that had sustained her throughout the endless evening suddenly drain away, leaving her trembling with exhaustion, and Alexander immediately noticed her fatigue and led her to a small sitting room off the main hall where a fire still burned, and suggested she rest for a few moments before her own carriage was brought round to take her and her mother home. Mrs. Langdon had already been settled in another room with tea and a comfortable chair, for she too was exhausted by the social demands of the evening, and so Eleanor found herself alone with Alexander in the quiet sitting room, where the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant movements of servants beginning the enormous task of clearing away the remains of the celebration. He sat beside her on the sofa, and took her hand in his and asked if she was well, for he had seen how pale she had grown during the last hour of the evening, and she assured him that she was merely tired but happy, overwhelmed by the beauty and success of the ball, and by the knowledge that it had all been arranged for her. Plain Eleanor Langdon, who had spent so many years invisible at such gatherings. Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and said that she must stop thinking of herself in such terms, for she was no longer merely Eleanor Langdon, but his betrothed, and soon to be his Duchess, and more importantly, she was the woman he loved and cherished above all others, and he would not tolerate her speaking ill of herself even in the privacy of her own thoughts. His words brought tears to her eyes, the happy tears that seemed to come so easily these days, now that she had finally allowed herself to believe in the reality of her transformed circumstances, and she told him that she would try to see herself as he saw her, though it would take time to undo 28 years of feeling overlooked and unremarkable. He wiped away her tears with his thumb, and promised that he would spend every day of their marriage reminding her of her worth until she finally believed it in her bones. And then he kissed her softly in the firelight, while outside the November night grew cold and the first hints of dawn began to pale the eastern sky. The morning after the engagement ball, Eleanor woke late with sunlight streaming through her bedroom curtains, and for a moment she lay still beneath the warm blankets, trying to comprehend that the extraordinary events of the previous evening had truly happened, and were not merely another of the desperate dreams that had sometimes visited her during her long years of invisibility and disappointment. Her body ached pleasantly from hours of dancing, and her mind felt thick with exhaustion, but when she turned her head on the pillow and saw the sapphire ring glinting on her finger where it rested on the coverlet, she knew with certainty that her life had indeed been transformed in ways she was only beginning to understand. She rose and dressed with help from the maid, choosing a simple morning dress of cream muslin, and made her way downstairs to find her mother still abed, recovering from the late night and the excitement that had sustained her through those glamorous hours at Thornfield House. The breakfast room was quiet and peaceful, with autumn sunlight slanting through the windows and warming the polished wood of the table where a simple meal had been laid out, and Eleanor poured herself tea and sat gazing out at the small garden where the last roses clung stubbornly to their blooms despite the advancing cold of November. She thought of Alexander asleep in his grand house across the city, and wondered if he too had woken to a sense of unreality, or if for him the engagement was simply the natural progression of a courtship he had pursued with such deliberate intention from the moment he first noticed her standing alone by the terrace doors at the Pembroke ball just 3 weeks ago. It seemed impossible that her entire life could have changed so completely in such a brief span of time, that she could have gone from invisible spinster to betrothed duchess in the space of 21 days. And yet the evidence sparkled on her hand, and the memory of his kisses still warmed her lips, and made her heart race with a combination of joy and lingering disbelief. Catherine arrived mid-morning, still in her travelling clothes, having come directly from her own home because she could not wait another moment to discuss every detail of the magnificent ball, and she embraced Eleanor with genuine warmth, and declared that the entire evening had been like something from a fairy story, with Thornfield House transformed into an enchanted palace, and Eleanor herself, the princess, at the center of the magical tale. They sat together in the morning room, while Catherine recounted the comments she had overheard during the ball and afterward in the carriages departing down the long drive, and Eleanor was surprised to learn that the general consensus had been one of approval and even admiration for the romantic nature of the match, though Catherine admitted with some reluctance that there remained pockets of bitter resistance among those who either envied Eleanor her good fortune or resented Alexander for his choice of a bride they considered beneath his station. Eleanor learned within days of the engagement ball that the social triumph of that glittering evening had indeed shifted the general sentiment in her favor, for callers continued to arrive at the Langdon residence with genuine warmth rather than mere curiosity, and invitations began appearing on the hall table requesting her presence at gatherings that would never have included her name before Alexander had chosen her as his bride and announced it so publicly to all of fashionable London. The most surprising development came in the form of a carefully worded note from Lady Pemberton, one of the most formidable hostesses of the ton and a woman whose approval could make or break a social reputation, inviting Eleanor and Alexander to a small but select dinner party at Pemberton House on November 12th, and when Eleanor showed the invitation to Alexander during his afternoon call that day, he smiled with satisfaction and said that Lady Pemberton's recognition meant that Eleanor had been fully accepted into the highest circles of society, despite her previously unmarked existence. Catherine arrived shortly after Alexander departed, and confirmed that an invitation from Lady Pemberton was indeed a significant honor, for the elderly countess entertained only those she deemed worthy of her notice, and her guest lists were legendary for including only the most distinguished members of the aristocracy, and the fact that she had invited Eleanor indicated that the engagement to Alexander had elevated Eleanor's social standing beyond what anyone could have predicted just a month earlier. Yet even as Eleanor's position in society solidified, and the initial scandal of the Duke's unconventional choice faded into general acceptance, there remained small pockets of resistance among those who could not, or would not, reconcile themselves to the idea that plain Eleanor Langdon had somehow captured the heart and hand of one of England's most eligible peers. Lydia Ashworth had become notably silent on the subject after her humiliation at the engagement ball, but her mother, Mrs. Ashworth, continued to make pointed remarks in drawing rooms about the mysterious nature of certain attachments, and how some women possessed arts of attraction that were not immediately apparent to the casual observer, comments that were clearly meant to suggest that Eleanor had somehow trapped or manipulated Alexander into an engagement he might later regret. These whispers reached Eleanor through various channels, including Catherine, who felt obligated to report such comments, though she assured Eleanor that no one of real consequence paid them any mind, and Eleanor found that while such remarks still had the power to sting her newly confident heart, they no longer possessed the ability to make her doubt the reality of Alexander's love or question whether she deserved the happiness that had so unexpectedly transformed her life. The wedding date had been set for December 20th, just over 2 months from the night they had first met at the Pembroke ball, and Alexander had explained that he saw no reason to delay their union once they had both acknowledged their feelings and committed to a life together, and Eleanor had agreed, though the rapid approach of her wedding day filled her with a mixture of excitement and nervousness about her new role as Duchess of Thornfield and mistress of his various grand estates.